everybody, welcome back to Writing Gems. For those of you who are just joining me, my name is Hannah L. Clark and I am the author of the young adult fantasy adventure called Kabogoth. It's the first book in a 7-book series, and what Writing Gems are just my way of passing along some bits and secrets of the trade that I've learned as I've gone through my own process of learning how to write a novel. Now, I've already taken you kind of through a few steps. My first 3 writing gems, the first one was on the basic structure of a story, or the Feralt's triangle. The second one was on story mapping, and the third one was on world building, or building your own world building Bible. And also kind of that brainstorming process that happens between, for me at least, between my story mapping and my actual outlining. Now today what I wanted to talk to you about is my actual outlining. That's the next step that I do in my writing process as I'm creating my story. And in my outlining, now this process is very meticulous, and I know that each writer is completely different. Some writers don't need the organization like I need it. My intent in sharing this with you is not to drive you crazy, because I know some of you might be driven crazy by the meticulousness of it, but to just kind of give you sort of a feel or a formula for and some ideas that might work for you. So with that in mind, I will share my process, which is by no means gospel. So what I do in my first part of my outlining is I kind of locate the chapter breaks, the natural chapter breaks in my story. And how I do that is I take the outline that I've created in my story map, and I don't know if you remember, but in my story map I broke it up into 3 parts, like a 3-act play, part 1, part 2, and part 3. And what I do is I take that sort of summary of my story, and I write anywhere from a 3 to 5 page synopsis of what I have created in my story map. That's that plot. And then I take that synopsis, or that the synopsis that I created in my story map, and then I break it up into those 3 parts that I located on my story map, those natural kind of acts of my story. What I do after that, and I'm going to draw it up here so you kind of can wrap your mind around it, because it can get a little bit confusing, but so I'll take my, my start at point 1, my synopsis for my story map, break it up into those 3 parts, part 1, part 2, part 3. And what I do with those 3 parts is I do the exact same thing I did with that synopsis, is I write a synopsis of each of those parts. And that just helps me really dig into my story and really get deep into the details of what's going on in my story. So after that, I take each of these parts, 1, 2, 3, and I do the exact same thing. I break each of these up into 3 more parts. And then I have 9 parts. I take each of those 9 parts and I write a synopsis, probably not a 3 to 5 page synopsis, but a good solid synopsis of each of those 9 parts. And then I do it again. I take each of these parts and I break them up into 3 parts. And then I have 27 parts. And with each of those 27 parts, I've found on average that usually is where I am able to find my natural chapter breaks. And finding your natural chapter breaks is a really important thing, because you don't want your chapters, you want your chapters to feel like chapters. And I read a long time ago about how a chapter should be a complete scene, with a cliffhanger on it, or a reason for your reader to turn the page, but it should be a complete scene. So I know people feel differently about that. Some people write really short chapters, other people write big long chapters, but whether it's short or long, there should be the completion of a scene in that chapter. And by doing this, mapping it out into 27 parts, it really helps me as I'm writing those synopses. I naturally tend to write out a scene, and that is what helps me break my overall big fat synopsis into chapters. So after I've got my chapters broken up and know pretty much where that's all going to, where each of those are going to take place and how many chapters I'm going to have in my book, then I start into the really in-depth outlining. And what I do is I start with something called an acronym that I learned about in a book by Orson Scott Card called Character and Viewpoint, The Elements of Style. And he, what it's called is MICE, is the acronym that he uses. And what that stands for is milieu, ideas, character, emotion, and I add an extra one on, which I actually learned from Dave Farland, who is a really great fantasy and sci-fi writer, but also a great writing teacher. He added an extra one on for events. And I'll explain each of these. So the milieu is something called, is the kind of the world building of your story. So you've got your, your characters and your, like, the world around your character, the sights, the smells, the colors, just what they're experiencing. You want to, that's what the milieu is. The ideas are any concepts, or I add like clues to the plot in my idea section, or just enlightenment that the main character receives along the way in that particular chapter. And there's the characters, like if there's any new characters introduced in that chapter. And then emotion is not only what the main character is experiencing, but also what the reader should be experiencing as they're reading through the eyes of the main character. And then the events, and the events for me is just the bullet point, step by step, of what actually happens in the chapter. So what I do with each of my chapters, after I've figured out how many chapters I have, I take each chapter and I use this MICE acronym, and I'll start each chapter outline by doing a little brief summary on each of these points of, like, the world building. What kind of elements do I need to include in this chapter to give the reader the experience of what the main character is experiencing in this world. And the ideas, I'll make notes to myself of any new ideas that are going to be introduced in this chapter that I need to put there in order to strategically plan out the revelation of the plot for the reader. Then the characters, I'll not only make a note of any new characters that are introduced in that chapter, but I'll also make a note of what point each of those characters are in their own personal character arc. And then with the emotions, I'll do what I said earlier. I'll make notes to myself of not only what emotion the main character should be experiencing, but also what emotion I want the reader to be feeling in that chapter. And then, after I've done all these things, then I will take and I will do my bullet list of the step-by-step events that occur in the chapter. And that really is kind of the basic chapter outline. So that is my very meticulous, in-depth, possibly annoying to you way of outlining my book. And I just do this process with each chapter. When I'm finished writing out my outline, then I will type it all up on the computer, and I will not only type it up, but I'll add any sorts of, like, pictures or anything I need to really keep me aware of elements that I need to add into that chapter. And oftentimes images or pictures or drawings that I've done myself really help me to remember or to recall certain ideas that I had, and when I go back and I'm actually writing that chapter, having those on hand really helps me to, one, not have to search everywhere for them, but also to be able to remember points that I wanted to add in that chapter. Also, it helps me because I send my chapter outlines to my illustrator, so she can have an idea of what I meant in that chapter and as she's illustrating. So, anyway, that is my outlining process, and I hope that it helps you in your own outlining process, maybe give you some ideas, and that's it. So, we will see you guys next time, and thanks for stopping by.